Hey homesteaders, gardeners, and cooks. My name is Jennifer. Welcome to Miles Away Farm. Thanks for joining me in my garden. This is the October garden tour, and this is the last garden tour of the season. We're getting down to the end. Excuse the noise in my background. My husband just finished cutting down a tree and he's moving things around with the tractor. Let's see how the raised bed garden is faring in October. So as always, I'm going to start on the north side of the garden. This is the pepper and eggplant bed. And we still are getting a few eggplants. We've gotten some nice harvests off of this. I have some that are roasted with a kind of a sweet and sour sauce in my fridge right now. This is Little Finger. And the one on the other side that I'll show you in a minute is Rosa Bianca, which is a more traditional Italian eggplant. This stuff that I'm standing in and crushing with my feet, this is comfrey. And you can see the blossoms on this. We have cut this down 3 times, maybe 4 times this season. Comfrey is, if you get the true comfrey that isn't a hybrid, so that it's actually fertile, it will self-seed, and then it also spreads underground by the roots. And it has very, very deep taproot. So once it's in, you'll pretty much never be without it. There's also a horseradish in here, and then there's a small rhubarb back in there. But what we do is we cut it to the ground and throw it around this little apple tree as mulch. And so it's pulling up minerals from deep in the ground and feeding the tree on the surface. And so I don't mind if I'm walking on this because literally you cannot kill it. It's just here forever. This is one nasturtium that I tucked into this back bed as a last minute gee whiz because I had it in a pot. And you can see it is still growing, and it is this is one plant, and that is at least 3 feet across at this point. I have learned an interesting lesson with nasturtiums this year, which is I usually grow them in pots, and they really don't love being in pots. And so they get a lot of die-off around the bottom. And if you put them in the ground, boy, and keep them watered, they just keep going. So I'm really impressed with this one nasturtium. I'm probably going to have volunteers in here forever. This is the pepper bed, and all of the right peppers in here have been picked. This is a sweet pepper, mostly sweet pepper bed. Here's one here that's kind of a goner. This is mostly Carmen. There's 4 Carmen, 4 bell peppers. This is Carmen, which is a sweet bullhorn style pepper. I could eat this green. I much prefer them red, so we're gonna roll the dice and see if we manage to get a few more ripe ones before the season is over. And this one is Cubanelle, and so better tasting green pepper if you're gonna eat them green. I have quite a few still in here, and they will turn red when they're ripe. There's a couple of shishitos in there that we've just quit picking because you can only eat so many shishitos before you're shishitoed out. And then there's bullnose in here in the middle, which is what this is. And I got a nice little harvest off of these, and this is putting on all kinds of new growth, but I probably won't get any more at this point because it's very late in the season. But it's been a really good pepper year. These have done really, really well in this back bed. I'll move them around next year, but I'm very pleased with the harvest. I have at least 3 gallons of chopped and frozen sweet peppers that I will use until I get peppers again ripe next spring. And then I have probably 6 or 7 in my fridge right now that I've just been eating in various dishes and eating with hummus, which is one of my favorite snacks in the summertime. This is one of the last of the zucchini plants I pulled out. This plant was all the way through there where Bodhi's just walking through. You could not walk through here because that zucchini had just taken over everything in there, and it got to the point where it was not manageable anymore, and so I trimmed off. You can see on this stem here how I trimmed this whole branch off, and then this one I took out completely. There was just too much plant and it was getting kind of ridiculous. And also I was a little bit zucchini'd out, but I'm still getting a little bit of production on here. They are mostly done, and they're starting to get, the fruit's getting smaller, and it tends to be smaller at one end than the other. You can see back in there, hopefully, There's one, and it's fat at the base and kind of narrow at the tip. That's an indication that we're getting to the end of the season. This is hollyhock that didn't do hardly anything at the beginning part of the season because it was way shaded out by all of the other stuff that was in here. And now that the rest of that is gone, it's doing quite well. I don't think these are gonna bloom this year, obviously, but I will leave them in here and we'll just let them bloom in here next year. So that'll be really glorious. Coming back around to the other side of this pepper and eggplant bed, here is Rosa Bianca. Oh, here's a good one. There's a Rosa Bianca. So I've pulled a few more out of here and I probably have a few more to come, but they're mostly finished. And then a lot of people don't realize shishitos, when they are ripe, they turn red. So if you want to save seed from your shishitos for next year, they need to be this color in order for them to be viable seed. So let some of them turn red. That usually happens just by the fact that you get to the point where you're just done eating them. And then of course, normally we eat them when they're like this. So I could get a small harvest out of here if I wanted to fry up a couple for dinner some night, but we're kind of moving into the fall crops instead. This is the glorious bean trellis that is just completely overrun. The asparagus beans or long beans that were in here, they're completely dead. Those plants died quite a while ago. This is all Scarlet Runner, which is still blooming. You can see them in there. And I haven't picked any of these to eat. I've had plenty of other beans. And so I'm just basically letting them mature. And I'll have lots of seed that I can either eat or replant for next year. But that's been absolutely beautiful. And you can see many Scarlet Runner bean pods on here. They need to be dry before they're ready to pick. So we've got a ways to go on that. And then this is the Italian heirloom bean, which finally produced very late in the season. And I've gotten a couple of big harvests off of here, but a lot of them I've just let go because this was also beans. This was bush beans, green beans. And I had 3 different varieties in here. And I harvested and ate a ton of those. I froze a ton of those. I already have some canned. And so I had way more beans than I really needed. And so the beans that are left in here now, this is Dragon Tongue. And then there's Provider and Maxabel in here as well. I'm letting these mature. So I'm letting them dry and mature and I'll harvest those and then I'll have beans to plant next year. So whatever's left in here, you can see that's getting too fat. I'm just letting these mature and dry in here rather than having ripped the plants out. I didn't have anything else I needed to put in here. And so I've just been letting them do their thing. And so you can see how fat these are. Those are gonna have nice beans in there to harvest for next year, for next year's crop. I did have soybeans in here. These I could tear out. I did harvest pretty much everything on here. There's a little bit. There's one that hasn't popped open. These go from not ripe to past their prime and opening up. You can see this one is opened up and just spread its seeds very quickly. And so it's really tricky. You can't look away essentially, or you end up with them just spreading themselves on the ground. And there's an example of what that soybean looks like when it's just about ready to pop open and spread itself on the ground. I could dry this and use it as a dried soybean and make tofu. That's gonna be a future video, is how to make tofu from scratch. But most of these got picked and I'm just kind of letting the plants molder in here. Interestingly, on this big Italian variety, as they start to mature, they have a black seed, but it's interesting to see, I'll bring you around to the other side. It's interesting to see how the pods themselves turn color. They look like a dragon tongue bean when they're getting more mature, which I didn't expect. There's a good example right there. So yeah, they're starting to get kind of mottled, which is fun. And then I have about 1 billion of these, so let me show you one. They're not finished yet, but when this is dry, it will be black. And so they're, at this point, they're kind of a blue color, which is really cool. So interesting to see the life cycle on that. Here's more of the giant zucchini that is still coming. This is buzz button or toothache plant, and I'm just letting these finish out and dry in here, and hopefully they'll reseed a little bit. Boy, a little goes a long way. I really think I only had 4 plants, and you can see, here's an example of a mature one, and look at all the seed from one of those. I'm probably going to regret having those in here and just leaving them, because they are going to spread seed like crazy. But a nice plant to have as a medicinal and really fun. These are in a box, but this is more nasturtium, still going strong. Another one of the variegated nasturtiums in here. And then this marigold has been blooming for 3 months. I'm definitely saving seed from this guy. Just incredible. It's just kept going, and I like how compact it is. So that's been really fun. There is one more marigold in this pot that's kind of leaned over into this bed at this point. This is called Jolly Roger, I think. And I've saved seeds from this for years. I did break off a big chunk of that out of there, but part of it is still going. This bed is done, except for carrots. We have carrots in this half of the bed, and I'm waiting for a frost. These are gonna taste much better once we have a frost, if I wait until I get a frost before I pull them, and so they'll sweeten up a bunch. So I'm gonna wait until we get a frost to pull those. They're holding pretty well. There might be some splits, we'll see how they look, but I'm not too worried about it. And interestingly, in this bed, this was red seed poppy, and then I had a bunch of Nigella in here that didn't really do very well. It got started too late. It went to seed really fast, and it got a little bit shaded out. And interestingly, that's what this is. And so it has reseeded itself from the spring, which is really interesting. And so I'm just kind of leaving this and letting it do its thing. And then this is a reseeded poppy. So that's a reseeded bread poppy. This is a reseeded bread poppy. This other thing in here that looks like a shamrock, that's wood sorrel, and it came in on a pot, and I have it absolutely everywhere. When the flowers or the seed pods on this are ripe and you brush them, they will actually pop and shoot their seeds out everywhere, and so they kind of explode, and so it's pretty hard to get rid of it once you've got it, but it's actually edible. It has kind of a very sour flavor, not unpleasant, lovely in a salad. And so I kind of like that it's around and that it's an edible, and I just leave it be. This is chamomile. That is a reseed from last year. And so that's also just reseeded itself. You know, nature abhors a vacuum, and I've got water in here. There's still drip. And so it just keeps going. This is lemon verbena. And I did cut the entire top of that plant off and dry it, but I've still got a little bit left to go here. It will not survive. As soon as we get a frost, it'll die. So I cut it back really hard, but it's still coming back and it's still going. So that's lovely, and it makes a lovely tea. The other herb in here that I cut back, this was summer savory, which is kind of like thyme and rosemary had a baby. And this was very tall and flopped over, and I cut it way, way back. There's actually 3 plants in here. And then this is anise hyssop, which has kind of a licorice flavor. It's in the mint family. And I did also cut the top off of that and dry it. And so this is the residual left over from that. This is a perennial in our area, but a very tender perennial. It doesn't tend to last more than about a season or 2 before it conks out. And so I often let it go to seed and then collect some seed from it so that I can always start new plants. So we're getting down to the end, which is good because it's October. We should be. This bed was herbs and celery, and you can see I tore out everything that was in the middle, and so there was cilantro and dill in here. This is the remnant of the dill stalks. I harvested the cilantro really heavily, and then I didn't bother harvesting any of the seed because there wasn't a whole lot of it. And then these were different kinds of basils, and so this is a Tulsi basil, this is a Thai basil, this was regular sweet basil, and they were all just huge, and I let them go and let the pollinators eat them for a long time, and then I decided to just trim everything way, way back, and so those all got a massive haircut. And there's a little bit coming here and there, but I knew that would probably be mostly the end of them, and I'm just letting them do their thing. There's not much left. And then celery, I'm just getting ready to harvest this. You can see in here, it's looking pretty good. There's usually damage. I don't know if you can see that along this stalk right here. There's always damage from earwigs. Earwigs love to get in those little nooks and crannies, and then slugs get in there and scrape on the sides of things as well. And so there will be some damage to some of those stalks from that, and that's just to be expected. But great for making stock and great for freezing and using in other things. I think I mentioned in another video this year I'm going to do onion, carrot, and celery, which is called mirepoix in French. And I'm gonna freeze those in bags together in the right ratio so that when I wanna make a soup or a stew, I just have all of that prepped and frozen, and all I have to do is open up a bag. This giant wall here, this is flat leaf parsley, and I should have done more with it. I had plans this year for doing things with it, and I just didn't get to it in time. And so I did make a little bit of pesto with it. This is a biannual, and so it will send up a flower stalk and reseed next year. You'll get a little bit of a harvest in the spring with some new leaves, and then it goes to seed, so it won't last in the spring. And I have probably a half a gallon bag of dried parsley, so I really don't need more dried. So just lovely, kind of doing its thing, but I haven't done a whole lot with it. This bed is pretty much finished. This was snap peas and shelling peas along this little trellis here. Those were long done. And then we've got chard, kale, and I had 4 kale plants in here. They all got very, very aphidy with the exception of this one. And so I took everything else out so that these guys could get some airflow and some breathing room. And probably this will take a frost, but I will probably just cut that stalk and blanch and freeze everything that's on here in a month or in a week or two. Those are just about, I'm about done. I've eaten a lot of kale. There is one red Russian kale here, and this plant was really stunted because it was super shaded out by everything else that was in there. And it was also getting a lot of aphids. And so I just recently chopped the top of that off, and I'm hoping I might get a little bit of regrowth around the base that's harvestable before the end of the season. And if I don't, that's okay too. The rest of this bed was, it was some spring stuff that I pulled out when they were done, and then it was squash. And so this was a patty pan. There were 3 patty pans planted in that corner right there. I'll come around. And one of them was absolutely monstrous and basically took up this entire corner, including most of this bed. And it started to get a virus. I think it's a mosaic virus. I don't know for sure. And so I tore out the whole plant just recently. But you can see the stalk and the size of that stalk on there. So this one plant had 3 different branches and was just taking over everything. This plant also had mosaic virus. It was much more small, and so I took it out. And then this one is still going. It doesn't have the mosaic virus yet, and so I might get a few more on it. And I did just harvest these little patty pans off of it this morning. And I also harvested these zucchini from the zucchini plant this morning. So we're still getting a small harvest. Here's some of the Italian green beans that weren't too far gone. So a little tiny harvest there. But yeah, this is just about finished, which is fine. And I intended to put in some lettuce and also to replant my peas, and I just didn't get to it in time. It's too late in the season. I should have done it probably at the very latest right at the end of August and perhaps mid-August, and I didn't get to it. So too late now, but that's okay. We have lots of compost and things to put in these beds to amend them. That is a collard, and it was also super shaded out, and it's also got a lot of aphids on it, and so I don't think we're going to get much out of that at this point. Although when I water, I do spray the aphids off just to make the aphids mad. Here's our very unruly green stalk. Strawberries on the bottom, sweet peas on the top. I planted the sweet peas way too late. They're starting to come back and get a lot of new growth. You can see this is new growth here, and this is nice new growth here. And so they're coming back with the cooler weather. I am unsure if they're actually going to bloom before it gets too cold. I doubt it. I think I just missed my window here. I do have a lot of runners on these strawberries. You can see the roots on here. What I need to do is actually just not clip these, leave them attached to the mother plant and run them up into some of these pockets where the sweet peas are, take the sweet peas out and just let those strawberries root. I usually, because we get fairly cold, I usually take this tower apart in the wintertime and just lay everything out onto the ground and then throw a tarp over it so that it's in closer contact with the soil and is less likely to freeze all the way through solid, and that way the strawberries survive. Like basically if this soil in here freezes completely through in a cold spell, it's very likely to kill those strawberries. Strawberries are cold hardy and they'll survive. They're perennial, but that's usually because they're in the actual ground and there's some insulating quality there. When they're in the open air in a tower like this, they're going to get way colder than if they were planted in the ground. So that's usually my strategy there. This is a volunteer horseradish that I actually tried to dig up last year, but I knew I wasn't going to get it all, and it's roaring back, and so I might do some fresh horseradish sauce this fall. And then I've kind of been holding out on you guys because back in this back pasture I have a squash bed, and I haven't shown you this. We have terrible problems with squash bugs here, and so I try to move my squash bed around to a different location on the property every year in order to take a long time for the squash bugs to find it. And it's mostly worked this year. I actually got a better production out of here than I was anticipating, and so I haven't seen a lot of squash bugs in here, so it's done well. So there's pumpkin, and this is a pie pumpkin, not an ornamental pumpkin. Pie pumpkins are sweeter. They're actually bred to be edible. Ornamental pumpkins are not the greatest in terms of eating, because they're really just designed to get big and look pretty. They're not really designed for a lot of sugar content. And then I've got spaghetti squash and butternut squash, obviously. Look at the size of that guy. I've got a lot of pie pumpkins in here that are still coming, interestingly, that are still green, kind of little guys. There's a nice, big, beautiful pie pumpkin. And then I also have in here some delicata, which is one of my favorite fresh eating squash. The reason a lot of this looks really beat up is because that's actually where the sprinkler was. And when I would turn the sprinkler on, it was doing some damage to the leaves of the plant. This whole thing was a bit of an afterthought, and so I just didn't fuss over it. So some of that damage was unfortunate, but I knew they'd probably be okay. God, there's a lot of pumpkins out here. Here's an example. This is delicata. And delicata is related to acorn squash. And there's a couple of different varieties. Some of them turn this tan color when they're ripe, and some of them stay yellow and green when they're ripe. And I have both varieties out here. Let me see if I can find, yeah. Here's an example. This one, yeah, that one's got some tan to it, but it's more yellow. So there's several different varieties. I have eaten them side by side and noticed absolutely zero difference in flavor. There's a couple of small delicatas in there. And then I did have some, I forget what they call them, but the baby butternuts, the personal size butternuts, and that plant did not do well. And so I haven't, oof, that one's rotted. That will go, this will go to the chickens. But yeah, so nice little crop of winter squash back here that did a lot better than I was expecting. People ask all the time, how do you know when winter squash is ready to pick? And one of the things that you will see is, can you pierce it with a fingernail? I have super hard fingernails, and so I can pierce like a fully ripe squash with my fingernail pretty easily because my fingernails are so hard. And so for me, that's not the greatest way to tell. I like to either look for a tendril. Can you see this little tendril here, how that's completely dry? The tendril that's closest to the squash, if that's dry, it's a pretty good indication that it's about done. And then I also look for this stem and whether this stem is starting to look dry rather than really, really green. There are 3 main varieties of squash, 3 genus species of squash that are grown in the United States. There's a 4th one that really is only grown in the South because it's too cold for most of the country to grow it. And the stems on those look different than, I'm trying to see if I can find an example of the way a butternut attaches. Not a great example out here. But sometimes the stems will look different, and that's just kind of an interesting genetic thing. The different species have a different look to them. Look at that big old butternut. Got some nice ones in here. Sorry, my neighbor is mowing. But yeah, so color change. The big thing on spaghetti squash, which I have a few of out here, is you want them to be canary yellow. And I picked the spaghetti squash out here that were ripe, and so these aren't ready yet. But this is not yellow enough. This should be, it should look like Tweety Bird. That's how you know they are really ripe. And so look for that color change on spaghetti squash. People pick them too early. And a lot of times in the grocery stores, you will see them and they have been picked too early because they're trying to rush them to market because they want to be, you know, that early fall sale of spaghetti squash. This one is also not quite ripe, not yellow enough, versus this guy. Can you see the color difference there? It's hard to tell because the lighting's changing out here, but this is much more, this one is much more yellow. That's what you're looking for. They should be really, really yellow. And obviously, if you're gonna get a frost, you've got what you got. They're not gonna get any riper. And so just pick everything. You know, there's that romantic notion of frost upon the pumpkin. And the first time I ever grew squash, I thought that that was something you were supposed to do, was let the pumpkins frost. And the reality is, if the squash freezes, it will ruin the squash. So you do not want your squash to freeze. So unless it's a very, very, very light frost, you want to pick your squash before you get a frost in order for it to have the best storage. Otherwise it won't stay. So if you know you're going to get a frost, pick everything. And they will continue to ripen up and turn color as they sit in storage. And some of them do much better. Once they've been stored for a while, they get sweeter as they store and age, and some of them are better eaten fresh. I will put a list up on the screen that talks about that so that you have, and you really need to know which genus species you're growing in order to know which ones need to be aged and which ones should be eaten right away. Okay, let's go see the big garden.